So this guy right here, love him or hate him, he changed the world. His name is Steve Jobs. He was the founder of Apple Computers, founder of Pixar, creator of the iPhone, and he's one of the greatest visionaries of the last 100 years. But looking at his legacy, there was a time where he actually really hated the company he started, and this is why he wanted out of Apple. Steve Jobs first launched Apple. The idea of them starting their own computer company was basically a joke because they launched on April Fool's Day. Their first product looked like this, and they were charging $666 for it just to show how edgy they were, and they only sold 150 units. What happened was a year later, Steve Jobs raised $250,000, so he put the money into making a much better computer called the Apple II, which was much sleeker looking, and he charged $1,300 for it, which would be about $7,000 today. But the issue was that it didn't sell that well at first because people just weren't ready for a computer yet. Where things changed for Apple was in 1979, they got the rights to a little software called VisiCalc, which was created by this guy right here, Dan Bricklin. VisiCalc was Excel before Excel. It was the first ever accounting software ever that people could use for bookkeeping or accounting, and it made Apple hit the map where every accountant in the country wanted it. Plus that, in 1980, Apple blew up, where they went from having $7 million in sales in 1978 to in 1980 having $178 million, and they IPO'd that same year, getting a market cap of $1.8 billion, which would be about $10 billion today. The issue that Steve Jobs had was he was just too young, because when he IPO'd Apple, he was only 25 years old. So what he did was he hired this guy right here, John Sculley, who was known for being the CEO of Pepsi. And he pitched him saying, hey, do you want your legacy being selling sugary drinks, or do you want to change the world? So he convinced him to become the president of Apple while he remained chairman. And he thought he'd be able to control John Sculley and get John Sculley to get Apple to be this brand that household and big corporations love. The reason that Steve Jobs wanted John Sculley was because of this product right here, the Lisa, which Steve Jobs named after his daughter. And the whole goal to this was Steve Jobs wanted something that was really expensive that businesses would buy, where it actually cost $30,000 in today's money. And he thought if John Sculley was CEO, he'd better push the product. The issue was making the Lisa was a drama factory, where basically Steve Jobs went through a ton of engineers saying they weren't doing a good enough job. And also at the same time, John Sculley just wanted to push the product out much quicker than Steve Jobs said it should be. So the Lisa ended up being a huge failure, costing the company millions, and it wasn't a good look for Steve Jobs. A year later, Steve Jobs would end up releasing the Macintosh along with Apple, making that his project. But the issue was it was still too expensive, costing $2,500, and it didn't have enough software for it. So even though they sold 70,000 units in the first 100 days, the sales plummeted afterwards, and John Sculley blamed Steve Jobs. It led to a corporate feud where basically Steve Jobs now is hating John Sculley, and he goes to the board while John was on vacation and says, hey, I want John fired and I want to be CEO again. But the issue was John got to the board first. So because of that, in the meeting that Steve Jobs thought he'd be firing John Sculley, he learned that he was fired instead. Because Steve Jobs was so pissed off at John Sculley, he decided to spite him and spite Apple, so he sold all of his shares in the company besides one so he can continue getting stock reports, and he was paid $110 million to do it, but he also tanked the stock at the same time. This is all going on. George Lucas is getting divorced, and he has to sell off parts of his company, so Steve Jobs bought one of the pieces, called it Pixar, and sold it to Disney for $7 billion years later. Eventually, Apple hires him back when they're nearly bankrupt, and he turns into a $1 trillion company. With that, I'm Charles Pearl. Subscribe.